Here on Nature League, we explore the amazingness of life on Earth. One biology topic that I'm fascinated by is the concept of biological clocks and the rhythms we see all over the world in every kind of species. We've created several videos exploring the theme of rhythms, and our first was all about the types of rhythms and cycles experienced by life on Earth. A rhythm is any kind of regular and repeated pattern. Repeated patterns often occur in cycles of some sort, where there's a process that goes to completion, then starts over. Biological rhythms are cyclic patterns that occur in organisms. These patterns are so important that there's actually an entire field of research dedicated to studying them called chronobiology. Chrono means time, bio means life, and ology means study of. So this entire field is about studying the periodic or cyclical processes of life on Earth. It's hard to miss rhythms and cycles living here on Earth. For starters, there's the whole light and dark thing happening outside on certain intervals, and depending on where you live, you might get regular patterns of warm or cold weather. The majority of rhythms and cycles on Earth are a result of the Earth itself, specifically the fact that it's a huge ball of mass rotating and orbiting another even bigger ball of mass in space. Even if the Earth was completely barren of life, the rocks, minerals, water, and atmosphere itself would all be affected by the rhythms and cycles happening throughout the galaxy. For starters, the Earth rotates on its own axis. This spinning results in what we call day and night. And while it's spinning, the Earth is also rotating in an orbit around the sun. Orbiting, in addition to the Earth's axis being tilted, results in what we call seasons. We've only touched on two types of cycles by discussing the Earth's spin and orbit, and yet these rhythms have a major effect upon life on Earth. Predator and prey dynamics are different during the night than during the day, and the changing availability of sunlight across the seasons affects ecosystems from the bottom up. And we haven't even talked about the moon yet. The orbiting of the moon around the Earth and its relative position to the sun results in the lunar cycle, that constant change we see in the night sky from new moon to full moon back to new moon. And while some of us certainly enjoy just watching those changes in the night sky, the lunar cycle has a big impact on life on Earth, specifically marine organisms. High tides are actually higher during the full moon, and these tidal rhythms result in and serve as environmental cues for behavioral changes. So yeah, in terms of rhythms and cycles, there's a lot going on with just Earth and its location in space. But the field of chronobiology isn't just about what's happening outside. It also considers what's happening inside an organism. Internal or endogenous biological rhythms are controlled by signals inside an organism. And some of the most important endogenous rhythms on Earth are called circadian rhythms. These repeat on a cycle of approximately 24 hours. That's right, the whole Earth spinning around its axis thing has led to some of the most widespread and critical biological rhythms on the planet. Circadian rhythms are present in animals, plants, and even bacteria. What's really cool is that while circadian rhythms line up with this external process, circadian rhythms are regulated by processes inside the body, and they happen even without environmental cues like light and temperature. And this isn't just in theory. When organisms are placed in continuously dark regions underground or even into space, their circadian rhythm still exists. It just gets slightly off or desynchronizes. This is possible because circadian rhythms are controlled by biological clocks. While you might keep track of time on your cell phone's clock, almost all of the tissue and organs in your body keep time by using biological clocks, which are made up of special proteins. Biological clocks direct the expression of specific genes as well as cellular activity. But here's the thing. There are so many cells and biological clocks throughout an organism that there has to be some kind of main synchronizer. Imagine if you have a power outage in your house, and when the power comes back on, you have to reset all of the clocks in the kitchen. And there's the one on the stove, microwave, coffee maker, etc. And you want them to all be in sync, so you probably set them all to your phone's time, or even one on a laptop. Bye-bye biological clocks. But what does this in organisms? In mammals, there's a master clock inside the brain that coordinates the biological clocks throughout the body. It's inside the hypothalamus and made up of about 20,000 neurons. And yes, it has a long and complicated name. The master clock structure of nerve cells is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. But luckily, we can go ahead and shorten that to the SCN. While environmental cues like light can reset or calibrate circadian rhythms by stimulating the SCN, Think about jet lag. Genes themselves are responsible for several components of biological clocks and feedback loops. These are called clock genes, and they've been discovered in humans, fruit flies, mice, fungi, and several other organisms. Scientists have found that clock genes can influence all kinds of things, including sleeping during the night, hibernation during the winter, and possibly even behavior. 24-ish hour circadian rhythms aren't the only periodic biological rhythms we see on Earth. Some rhythms are shorter than 24 hours, and these are called ultradian rhythms. These include things like 90-minute REM cycles during sleep and cyclical fluctuations of hormones throughout the day. And some biological rhythms are much longer than circadian rhythms. These are called infradian rhythms and include seasonal patterns like migration, hibernation, and reproductive cycles. Life on Earth seems really unpredictable at times, but even in all of its chaos, life has some patterns that are deeply set across species, time, and space. We're only recently discovering the genetic mechanisms underlying the mysteries of these rhythms, and who knows what we'll find out next about the cycles of life on Earth. Most rhythms and cycles we experience on Earth are actually due to things happening in space, way farther away than the systems that I typically study. So I spoke to Dr. Mark Reiser at the University of Montana to learn more about solar and lunar cycles in particular. We are lucky to be joined by Dr. Mark Reiser.
I work in the Physics and Astronomy Department and Geosciences. I'm an academic advisor and outreach coordinator.
Physics and Astronomy and Geosciences. From the outside, it might seem like, how does that have anything to do with rhythms or species, animals, plants? But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the cycles we see in life on Earth occur because we are in space and things are moving, and it's not just us. There are all kinds of components that change and spin and tilt. And so I was hoping that you could maybe go through some of these basic processes and movements of things in space that have to do with us and what happens on Earth.
The moon in our sky, obviously as a source of light, but then the gravitational interactions, that cycle is roughly a 29.5-day cycle between successive new moons or successive full moons, however you want to measure that.
So with the lunar cycle right now, it's about 29.5 days from one, so we'll say a new moon to another new moon, or a full moon to another full moon. But is that something that's just constant and has always been that way, or is it something that's changing?
The interactions between the Earth and the moon are very strong, and what actually happens is the Earth is actually being slowed ever so slightly in its rotation by kind of the gravitational drag induced by the moon. And as that happens, the moon actually drifts a little bit farther away from the Earth, and the period between new moons is actually slowly going up as the moon gets a little farther away. A very slow process and a very gradual effect. It's something on the order of around a centimeter or two a year that is drifting away. We've actually confirmed and measured this with the mirrors left behind on the moon by the Apollo astronauts. We can measure that distance to great precision. If we still call a month and want to base it off of the moon, we will have to somewhat increase that.
Right.
But yeah, they'll be longer than 29.5 days in the future.
When I think about the way that life on Earth is affected and has kind of environmental cues, so much of that has to do with light and something like photo periods, so light periods, so how much light there is and when, and that changes throughout the year and changes throughout even the day. And so the biggest things that Earth and the sun do, what's kind of happening in space? What makes a season happen?
The primary mover, or the primary driver, I should say, in the seasons is the orientation of our axial tilt relative to the sun and in whichever hemisphere you're living in at that time. For more or less half the year, people in the northern hemisphere are more tilted to that side of the globe is essentially more favored in terms of its tilt towards the sun, and that essentially leads to a couple factors then from there are basically how direct the sun's rays are, so ultimately how intense the sunlight is on the ground, and then how many hours of time actually go by before you get your sunset once the sun rises. So you get longer days in those months when your hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, and you get more intense sunlight.
I was also thinking about some longer term cycles that we might see and how that affects some of the rhythms and energy on Earth and for things that live. And so the idea of solar cycles and these 11-year cycles, I was wondering if you could kind of explain what those are.
Yeah, on Earth, one kind of rudimentary way to analyze one of the cycles of the sun is just count sunspots. Just how many of these little darker blemishes do we see on the visible surface of the sun or the photosphere? And we see them kind of ebb and flow in regular, pretty reliable 11-year intervals. You oscillate between high and low sunspot numbers within an 11-year time, and in that time we notice a lot of really tangible changes on Earth as far as in the sky. One obvious correlation with those sunspot numbers is the amount of auroral activity that we get in our skies. So if you get a lot more sunspots being visible on the surface, that tends to be correlated with solar storms, and basically particles are basically ejected from the sun's surface at a much more readily. There are many more holes in the corona, basically where these particles can escape from, and you get a much greater frequency of cascades of particles smashing into our atmosphere. One species that is dramatically impacted sometimes by these solar outbursts are going to be human beings, whether it be satellites or radio communications, things of that nature. It can knock out cell communications for good chunks of time, and that's why we want to be kind of aware of when these solar storms are happening, so we monitor the sun for those. So during these increases of sunspot numbers, we are more vulnerable, I suppose, to those solar outbursts.
And now a word, not from our sponsors, but from the dictionary. Welcome to this month's Wild Word. Once a month on Nature League, we'll look at the etymology, or origin and history, of words related to nature. This month's theme is rhythms, so we're going to break down one of the most important biological rhythms on Earth. This month's Wild Word is circadian. During our lesson plan, we discussed examples and mechanisms of circadian rhythms. We also touched on the time period of circadian rhythm cycles, which is about 24 hours. It just so happens that the etymology of this word is pretty dead on when it comes to the definition. The word circadian can actually be traced back to Latin, but it has two separate parts we should look at. The first part, circa or circa, is a Latin word meaning about or around, occasionally used for estimations. The second part of the word circadian contains the root dia, and this comes to us from the Latin word dies, meaning day. Circadian rhythms have periods of close to 24 hours across species, making them one of life's rare constants. However, the periodicity can change due to environmental variables, so these rhythms aren't exactly 24 hours on the dot. So while a formal definition of circadian is recurring naturally on a 24-hour cycle, even in the absence of light fluctuations, circadian comes from two Latin words that literally mean about a day. And while that isn't very wild, it is beautifully appropriate.
There is life on Earth represented in the way that we look at our cosmos, right?
Yeah.
And so I think about constellations.
We've got bears, we've got rabbits, we've got a crab, we've got a bull, we've got half goat, half sea creature of some kind. We've got a whale in some sort. You know, we had talked about cetus, and then we've got a couple of dogs, we've got a wolf, a ram.
Somewhere close to like half of all named or officially recognized constellations actually are based on species here.
Yeah.
To me, that shows us kind of how important we feel life on Earth is, even when we're looking at somewhere where we aren't, you know, living necessarily, but still kind of put our print as we see these things in the sky.
Absolutely.
Earth is this ball of matter hurling through space and spinning, and it's you can't unwed the two. The fact that everything that is happening in space and in our galaxy affects us and everything else that lives here. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for watching this special field trip. We're talking about rhythms and cycles on Earth and how that has to do with the way that things are moving and tilting and changing in space, in our universe.
While the locations of the Earth, Sun, and Moon in space significantly impact life on Earth, not all species are affected in the same way. In fact, the amount of sunlight a species is exposed to can change dramatically just based on where they live. One of the most extreme versions of this rhythm is found in the Arctic, where winter days can have almost no sunlight. In a format called Denatured, I broke down a recent scientific journal article about the circadian rhythms of reindeer that call this place home. For this month's Denatured segment, we're going to look at an article released in September 2018 in the journal Scientific Reports. This month is all about rhythms and cycles, and in this month's lesson plan, we explored some endogenous biological rhythms, ones that are regulated by internal signals. We discussed how some of these endogenous rhythms are so strong that they can persist regardless of environmental changes in things like light and temperature. Some of the most common endogenous rhythms on Earth are circadian. That is, they operate on a cycle of about 24 hours. That 24 hours lines up with the rotation of the Earth on its axis, and the daily light-dark cycle is pretty hard to miss. But Different species and individuals experience these daily light-dark cycles differently, especially depending on where they live. For example, growing up in Florida, there wasn't a huge difference between the length of days throughout the year. Sure, when the clocks changed due to daylight savings time, it got darker earlier or later, but in general, there wasn't too much of a difference. Fast forward to my life now in Montana, and whoa, maximum daylight time during the summer can be more than 7 hours longer than in the winter. I'm still getting used to the massive seasonal differences, and I've been here for about 5 years. These experiences in my own life have made me wonder what daily light-dark cycles are like for species that live at the poles of the Earth, where there's the biggest difference between winter and summer days. In this paper entitled "Circadian Rhythmicity Persists Through the Polar Night and Midnight Sun in Svalbard Reindeer," the researchers investigate a species very familiar with this, a reindeer that lives in the Arctic. So here's what's already known. Circadian clocks are entrained, or calibrated and set to daily 24-hour rhythms by external cues. These cues are called Zeitgebers, and they include things like temperature and light. Constant 24-hour Zeitgebers aren't really present in polar regions where day-night cycles are so extreme. Without a predictable night and day available throughout the year, scientists figured that circadian rhythms in Arctic animals would deviate from 24 hours. There's something else to consider as well when it comes to the daily rhythms in the Arctic. For large herbivores like reindeer, food is hard to come by during midwinter when the ground is frozen and there isn't as much plant growth. They make up for this by fattening up during the summer and then living off these reserves during the winter. So maybe it's advantageous to give up the whole circadian rhythm thing in order to take advantage of turbo feeding in the summer and then minimizing activity during the winter. Some studies have reported a lack of circadian rhythms in several Arctic species, and even mentioned that this loss of 24-hour rhythm might just be a regular thing in vertebrates living at the poles. However, these studies were based only on the timing of certain behaviors. In this new study, researchers not only looked at behavior, but also physiological variables. So let's check out the variables this team measured on the study group of Svalbard reindeer. The team measured 4 main response variables. These are variables that may or may not change in response to something. In this study, the first response variable was resting heart rate. In addition to that, they also got a temperature reading. Behavior was also a variable of interest, and they measured both the activity of the reindeer as well as the changes in their head positions, which indicated grazing. So these were the response variables the team measured. However, they wanted to see if these variables changed in response to something, and those somethings were the predictor variables. In this study, the predictor variables included the daily changes in sun radiation, daily changes in outside temperature, and the average amount of vegetation on the landscape. What's cool is that they measured all of these variables over the course of an entire year, meaning that they could investigate what happens behaviorally and physiologically day to day, and also across seasons. These reindeer live in the Arctic, and that comes with a lot of unique challenges. For example, during the midwinter, they experience a polar night where the sun doesn't actually rise above the horizon. And in the Arctic summer, there's a period of midnight sun where there's continuous daylight. The whole point of the study was to see if circadian rhythms persist in a species that's subject to such incredible differences in environmental cues like daylight and darkness. So what'd they find? Overall, they noticed seasonal changes in their response variables throughout the year. But what about daily and circadian rhythms? Well, the team found significant evidence of daily rhythms in all 4 response variables. What's more, these daily rhythms existed throughout the year, even during periods of polar night and midnight sun. However, they wanted to know if these rhythms were influenced more by the availability of sunlight or by the availability of vegetation. Basically, is this behavior because it's light outside or because there's a lot of food? To check this out, the team compared months of midnight sun with little or no plant growth to months of midnight sun with new plant growth. They observed strong 24-hour rhythms in the response variables during the period of midnight sun without new vegetation. During months with constant daylight but new plant growth, these 24-hour rhythms were still present but somewhat weaker. These results imply that periods of constant light aren't the only thing affecting behavioral and physiological changes. In these reindeer, the weakening of daily rhythms is more likely due to vegetation and feeding instead. This article was published in a high-profile journal, and I've come across it on several science news sites. Here's why I think this article is making the rounds. All life on Earth is subject to the fact that the Earth rotates on its axis. Some organisms experience this rotation differently depending on where they live, especially in terms of daily light and dark cycles. Amazingly, we see circadian or daily cycles in all kinds of organisms and in all kinds of places. So, how deeply entrained circadian rhythms are in organisms is sort of a big question in biology. And to see evidence of circadian rhythms in organisms that live through polar nights and midnight suns is pretty incredible. Another reason these results are a big deal has to do with the current changes happening on Earth. With climate change, some species are expanding their ranges into the Arctic, and this will affect the light light dark cycle they experience daily and throughout the year. As with any piece of new research, there are several areas of improvement that exist in this study. My first issue is the sample size. While the team collected an incredibly large amount of data on these reindeer and their environment, the sample size of the reindeer themselves was only 4. Measuring variables on only 4 individual reindeer could lead to issues with generalizing the results to full populations. Another thing that jumped out at me while reading this article is that the results from this paper are at odds with previous research on the same topic. Past publications have recorded a lack of daily rhythms in polar vertebrates, including reindeer. However, the authors of this paper note that the results are different from previous ones because of how often they collected data and the statistical tests they did. My critique here isn't with this new paper, but with our current acceptance of past results. The truth is that our analytical power is rapidly increasing, and the availability of greater statistical power means that we might need to redo previous studies and keep an open mind about the veracity of currently standing results. Room for improvement aside, one thing I really love about this project is how they incorporated so many different kinds of data. I mean, the data sets included things like reindeer head movements, remotely sensed changes in vegetation growth, and solar radiation. It's really neat to see the melding of living and non-living variables within a single study. We couldn't complete the theme of rhythms without letting my friend Adrian ask me a question about these phenomena. In this installment of From A to B, Adrian asked me if full moons actually have any effect on human and non-human animals.
So my question is there really something about like a full moon that has an actual measurable effect on people and animals? Because I feel like the full moon is like this romantic, ooh, the moon, wolves howl at it, the people are lunatics, because that's the thing. That doesn't seem like a real thing. It doesn't feel like it should be a real thing.
What does a full moon give or change or do, at least on land?
You can see better at night.
So, I mean, don't you think that having extra light at night would affect species?
The only difference that a full moon has on me is when I take out the garbage at night, I'm like, oh, hey, I can see where I'm going.
But when you take out that trash, you're not necessarily thinking about either like running from something or trying to catch something. So let's get into that perspective. Imagine that you are a predator, and let's say that you are a predator that hunts at night.
Okay.
So what are some examples, like groups of animals that do that?
Owls.
I was thinking more lions.
Oh, really? I thought that lions hunted in the day.
So they do, but I think that that's a skew in terms of like nature documentaries. It's way easier for the film crew to catch those than having to do the night vision stuff. But if you actually look at patterns, you see a lot of nighttime hunting by African lions. So imagine that like your job is to be stealthy in order to catch your next meal. If you, let's say instead of taking out the trash, in the trash can was your next dinner, and some other people wanted it too. If it was a full moon outside, how successful would you be if you were trying to sneak up on something or gain something?
Less?
Well, yeah, it's absolutely going to affect it, especially if you rely on the cover of night. And so one of the ways that the full moon and lunar cycles affect life on Earth definitely has to do with predator and prey relationships and when the majority of predation happens. So there have been several studies that have shown that carnivores will actually decrease their hunting frequencies during full moons. Again, because it's kind of like, you left the light on, I'm not gonna be able to get anything, they can see me.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there was a study a few years ago that looked at the incidence of lions hunting and killing humans in Africa, and they found that it happened the most in the days right after the full moon. And that's really cool because what happens in the days after the full moon is that the period of darkness between like sunset and moonrise is actually way darker than the other days of that lunar month. And so if it's much darker and you are a nighttime predator and humans are then staying out later, human activity too, like when they're outside, but it totally has like statistically significantly more attacks by African lions on humans in those days right after. But that's one of those interesting things of like, lions are crazy after the full moon because they're crazy. Is that what people say? I think.
Exactly how they say it too.
So there's an actual reason though, like why attacks might go up.
Okay, what about humans? Like, what kind of effects would a full moon have on humans?
Why does it always have to be humans with you? It's fine.
No, okay, it doesn't have to be humans this time.
I'll humor.
No, it doesn't. You'll human?
I'll humor you.
Humor you.
You got humaned.
You'll be humored.
That's the one. So it's really interesting, right? Moving inside over time has made it to where we are not exposed as often to something like the moon. If we sleep inside and curtains down, we don't have that visual cue as much as other species that don't live in like houses with curtains and things.
Do you think that maybe early humans used full moons for extra hunting time? That's why people feel energized during full moon?
I think that's totally fair.
Is that a thing?
I think that's fair.
Because I mean, we can't see in the dark very well.
Right. And so so humans straddle that line between like prey versus predator, especially, thousands of years ago. And so in the predator version of that, probably. So for things on land, I'd say the amount of light is absolutely going to affect both predator and prey. But land is such a small part of the Earth as a whole.
3%.
So with the land being 3% of the Earth, my point is we should probably talk about the oceans.
Yeah, fine.
The moon affects the tide. And so during a full moon, you have the highest tide available. So species use that differently as well.
Yeah.
So like for laying eggs on the shore, some turtles will actually wait until the full moon when that tide is higher so that they can get farther up the shore. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So like that's one way. But also, if you are an organism that doesn't necessarily use a visual cue or use an auditory cue or chemical cue, light can actually be a cue if you need to line something up, if you need to synchronize.
Totes.
So
that's why little baby turtles use the moon to navigate their way back to the sea.
Yeah.
And that's why when there's cities on the edge of the oceans, all the little baby turtles die. Turn off your lights, people.
So here's the thing, light pollution is such an issue because species rely on the moon as a light source.
Moths.
Right? I know, you and your moths. So light can be a communication device for synchronization. So when would maybe an organism need to synchronize some event?
Mating.
Exactly. So here's what's really cool. Corals and coral reef, like off of Australia, they do it corals all around the world do it, but there's this amazing spectacle at the ones off of Australia. They, in December, at the full moon, they actually all release their gametes, so egg and sperm, into the water at the exact same time. So if you synchronize and line it up, there's a higher probability of actually having higher reproductive success. But if you're sitting there in your coral, you can't necessarily send a group text and be like, we're releasing gametes at 10. I mean, you could. I'm not ruling it out. That's a kind of cool thing that the moon and moonlight can actually use as a communication device, specifically for like a synchronized event, which is pretty sweet. Mm-hmm. Another thing with moonlight, did you know that it has UV rays? It basically almost acts like a black light on certain proteins. So there are actually these scorpions that glow in the moonlight. So during a full moon.
That's pretty dope.
So dope. So during the full moon, they'll actually be bright. It's like this neon blue. It's so cool. So those are just a few of examples of the effect that the moon can have either with light or with the way that it affects tides. And then a full moon it's almost like that effect, but ramped up. And so this idea of like lunacy and like crazy behavior at a full moon, there's something to be said for behaviors changing for certain reasons. It's not like a crazed thing, but it has more to do with either like basically success, either by getting prey or avoiding capture or communicating. So once again, it's almost like it's a piece of adaptation for life on Earth. The moon does stuff.
The moon's crazy. That crazy moon.
That's why it's lunatics. It's not that the people who are being affected by the moon are crazy, it's that the moon is crazy.
As we all go through the daily, monthly, and yearly rhythms and cycles of our lives, it's nice to remember that all life on Earth experiences this in some way or another. Thanks so much for watching, and if you'd like to keep going on Life on Earth adventures with us here on Nature League, make sure to go to youtube.com/Nature League, subscribe, and share. Hey guys, we now have a Nature League pin on dftba.com. Click on the link in the description below to get yours.